UFC 299 is this weekend, and everyone's super pumped for the card that's more stacked than UFC 300, which is pretty crazy to say. And I'd even say if you look at the card, it's closer to UFC 298, Volkanovski versus Topuria, than it is UFC 300. But because of the hype that was built around UFC 300 and them having to settle for a main event, people are actually deeming UFC 299 a better card. So we're actually going to go and compare UFC 299 with UFC 300 and see which truly is the stronger and better card.
Yeah, we're going to be going over the main card because both UFC 300 and UFC 299 have great prelims, and we all know that when we tune in for a UFC pay-per-view, we're looking at the main card. So UFC 300 actually has 6 main card fights, so we'll start with this extra main card fight, and it's Aljamain Sterling versus Calvin Kattar, which obviously isn't a crazy fight, but Aljo is a former champion, and Calvin Kattar is a very high-level fighter.
Yeah, I would put this fight, so Calvin Kattar versus Sterling, as the featured bout or the third fight in UFC 299. But we'll go over exactly why. But honestly, it'd be the third best fight on UFC 299. But on UFC 300, it's a fight that's going over the radar because it's the 6th fight of a 6-fight main card. So it's an incredible fight to see Sterling, who's actually one of the best bantamweights based on resume. If you dive into his fights, maybe it might be a little different. But he's one of the best bantamweights. Lost to O'Malley. He's going to challenge himself at a higher weight class at featherweight. So it's going to be an exciting fight to see what Sterling can do at featherweight against a good opponent coming off an injury, which is Calvin Kattar.
Yes, and the 5th fight, so the first fight of UFC 299 and the second fight of UFC 300 main card. For UFC 299, it's Song Yadong versus, I'm blanking here.
Petr Yan.
No, Petr Yan. And the 5th fight for UFC 300 being Jiří Procházka versus Alexander Rakic, and I would have to say that the UFC 300 fight is better than UFC 299.
Yeah, honestly, Procházka is a very entertaining fighter coming off a fight against Pereira for the light heavyweight title, where he had a lot of great moments. He said he was coming off an injury, so that might have not even been the best version of him, and he's coming off against someone who's hyped up in the division, coming off an injury, which is Alexander Rakic. I think it's going to be a very entertaining fight, while you see Petr Yan and Song Yadong. Song Yadong's last fight against Chris Gutierrez, you could see he's a good fighter, but it wasn't his best performance. And then Petr Yan is obviously on a decline, and Petr Yan is not at the level of Procházka when you think about the recent fights.
Yeah, I mean, 2 former champs, Petr Yan as well as Jiří Procházka, but Jiří Procházka is just coming off of a loss, and he actually looked pretty good against Alex Pereira in that second round until he got knocked out, and Petr Yan coming off of a 50-45 loss to Merab Dvalishvili. I think that the light heavyweight fight will be better, especially because the rankings are higher. Yuri's 2nd ranked, and Alexander Rakic is 5th, and then Petr Yan, I believe, is 5th ranked, and he's higher than Song Yadong.
Yeah, so now going into the 4th fight. So right now, UFC 300, it's technically up 2-1, but we'll say 1-0 because it's a 6-fight main card. So on UFC 299, it's going to be Gilbert Burns versus Jack Della Maddalena, and with UFC 300, Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. This is when you see the power of UFC 300, because this is not even close. If you look at a fight card, one of the most stacked that we've been alive for, UFC 280, Makhachev versus Oliveira, you had Belal Muhammad versus Sean Brady as the featured prelim. That kind of gives me Burns versus Jack Della Maddalena vibes. It's a featured prelim, not on a stack card, not like a card overall. But on this card, it's the 4th fight. And then you have Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. That could honestly, for me, is better than the main event for UFC 299. Oliveira is one of the biggest stars in the sport. And it's one of the most, probably I would say, is the true BNF has the most entertaining fights.
Yeah, I think Charles Oliveira has to put the most entertaining fights on, and then he's fighting Arman Tsarukyan, who is an up-and-coming fighter. He's obviously shown he has a lot of potential. Actually gave Islam Makhachev a very competitive fight, and obviously they're both fighting each other. It's going to be a very high-level fight. And then when you go to Gilbert Burns, Jack Della Maddalena, he's an okay prospect. I've messed up so badly, but Jack Della Maddalena is, and obviously he's a very good prospect, but he doesn't really get you up and out of your seat. And then Gilbert Burns is coming off of a loss, and it's really hard to compete with a Charles Oliveira fight.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to compete with that. Burns coming off of a, what's Burns coming off? A win against Masvidal, which is Washington Masvidal.
Loss against Belal Muhammad.
Oh, he lost against Belal Muhammad, that's right. And we haven't seen him since it was a bad injury. And then Jack Della Maddalena is coming off a win against Kevin Holland, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But not anything hype. Oliveira's coming off a big win against Beneil Dariush, and so is Tsarukyan.
Yeah.
And Oliveira's won, I believe it's like 12 of his last 13 fights. Sarukian is also on an incredible win streak as well.
Yeah, I think the only guy he lost to was he lost to Makhachev and Gamrot, which was controversial.
Yeah, so this is a high level fight. Oliveira is one of the biggest stars in the sport. You know what you're getting with the Charles Oliveira fight, and the fact that he's on this card, not even in the first 3 fights, is incredible and says a lot about UFC 300. While Burns and Madalena being the 4th fight on 299 says a lot about UFC 299. Now let's go into the featured bout, or the 3rd fight for each card. UFC 299 is going to be Kevin Holland versus Michael Venom Page, and UFC 300, Max Holloway versus Justin Gaethje for the BMF title. Again, like the 4th fight, not even close.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Venom Page coming to the UFC, it's pretty exciting, but how are you going to beat Gaethje versus Holloway? Holloway going up 1 weight class, been around for a long time. Former champion, former dominant champion. I would still say he's in his prime. Some people think he's not just because he lost to Volkanovski, but in terms of age-wise, he is, and Volkanovski's obviously one of the best featherweights of all time. Then you have Justin Gaethje, who's later in his prime, but he's honestly just looking better and better, and it's going to be a striking matchup where the fans are going to love, and it's just really hard to beat that. The BMF title doesn't really make any sense. It's kind of stupid, but the fight, if you just look at the fight alone, Gaethje versus Holloway, how is Michael Venom Page and Kevin Holland going to beat that? I don't even think it comes even close.
Yeah, I was talking to him, I was like, Kevin Holland versus Michael Venom Page as the featured bout of a fight, such a stacked card, is ridiculous. Kevin Holland always makes excuses how he doesn't want to fight for the title, and honestly, he's entertaining because he can get some finishes, but he's nowhere near the level of Gaethje, Holloway, Oliveira. And Michael Venom Page, he's 36 and hasn't fought in the UFC. He's 36. We've been seeing a lot Michael Page, how the age has been impacting a lot of these fighters. Michael Venom Page is 36, and people act like he's like 28, 29. So that fight that is the featured bout makes no sense to me, and you can't be ranking it so damn high like people have been saying it is when you've got this fight there as the featured bout. If this fight was the 5th fight on a main card, then it's like, okay, maybe. I would even say, again, a strong feature prelim. But the 3rd fight, you guys can make a comment if you think I'm wrong, but I feel like it's just not as crazy as most people think. Anyways.
Yeah, UFC 300 definitely takes that point. Now going on to the co-main events for both of these pay-per-views. UFC 299 being Benoit Saint-Denis versus Dustin Poirier, and for UFC 300 being a women's title fight, Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan. Yeah,
so we're obviously going to give it to Poirier versus Saint-Denis, but I don't think it's that far away because title fights are title fights ultimately. And with the Poirier versus Saint-Denis fight, that's a featured fight. If you look at some of the strongest cards we've ever seen, UFC 268, Covington versus Usman 2. Chandler versus Gaethje was the 5th fight, but it technically was the featured fight of that card. Then you've got UFC 281, which was Pereira versus Adesanya. That one, the 3rd fight, or the featured fight, was Poirier versus Chandler. Saint-Denis versus Poirier, in reality, is not a co-main event, but it's a featured fight, but it got promoted to a co-main event. But for some reason, people are acting like it is so great, when in reality, it's just, for a stacked card, this is a featured fight.
Yeah, I think the co-main events for both of these cards aren't crazy. I would still give the edge slightly to UFC 299 because women title fights obviously are not the best. I mean, look at Raquel Pennington versus Mayra Bueno Silva. But to be honest, Zhang Weili and Yan Xiaonan are actually very skilled. For some reason, in this division, they actually throw proper punches and actually show like high-level MMA.
Zhao Xiaonan knocked out Jessica Andrade. Like, she's legit with her boxing. And then Zhang Weili actually looks like a man when she's fighting, so that also helps. So, like, in terms of women's title fights, I'd say this is like the most high level that we've seen, at least in the last year.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, the co-main events, nothing crazy. Give the edge slightly to UFC 299. That one's 5 rounds as well. But UFC 300 for a women's title fight, not bad. And now on to the main events. Me and him always say that when it comes to cards, the main event makes the card. If there's a balanced card and then one card that sucks ass, one that comes to mind for me is Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 3, where the undercard, which is terrible, but I was still freaking hyped. Because the main event gets you up, gets you excited for the fights, and the main event for UFC 299 obviously being Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera, and the main event for UFC 300 being Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill. Yeah. And I'd have to give the point to Alex Pereira and Jamahal Hill.
Yeah, with me, like when he was kind of feeding off his point, when I think of a hype fight, a great card, it's when I wake up the night of the fight, or the day of the fight, and I'm like, I am so excited for the main event. And O'Malley versus Vera doesn't get me anywhere near that. Hill
Less than 298 too.
Yeah, it's less than. That's what I was saying. It's less than 298. Volkanovski versus Topuria was way better because Topuria promoted the fight well. I like how Topuria promotes fights. O'Malley, all he does to prepare for fights or promote fights is to get his hair dyed and got a bunch of face tattoos. That's all he did. And when I get up on UFC 299, the day of 299, I'm not going to be very hyped because O'Malley versus Chito Vera, we'll get into that in a second, but is a co-main event. It's a good co-main event. Imagine if you had put Pereira Hill on 299 and bumped every one of those fights down. That's a stacked card. And then you put UFC 300, you put like Leon versus Hamzat. That right there would be two great cards. Or I guess more realistically, Tbilisi versus Adesanya on 300. Those are two great cards. But O'Malley versus Vera is a co-main event. O'Malley is not a star. He only sells to little kids who don't buy pay-per-views. And he also sells to these crackheads who are in college who are casual fans who also don't buy pay-per-views. And then Chito Vera was number 6 when the fight was made. That is a co-main event that's been bumped up to main event status, and then they add a bunch of balanced fights to the card, and people say it's stacked, but it's missing those fights that get you up that day.
As much as some people are going to want to tell you that O'Malley's a star, and as much as the UFC is going to try and tell you that O'Malley's a star, he's not, and that's why this pay-per-view or that main event isn't great. Especially when you add that Chito Vera does not deserve to be fighting him. He was number 6 ranked, now he's number 5. And Corey Sandhagen beat the shit out of him.
Yeah.
And Corey Sandhagen is now waiting and Chito Vera's fighting. It doesn't feel great when the person who deserves to be fighting isn't fighting. And then when you go on to the UFC 300 main event, Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill, the reason why it's kind of disappointing is because we thought there was going to be something huge. But when you actually look at it, Jamahal Hill versus Alex Pereira is going to be a high-level fight. It's going to be a great striking fight. Alex Pereira actually becoming one of the biggest stars of the sport. Kickboxing champion, double champ. And then you have Jamahal Hill, who's only lost one time, and that was actually to submission to Paul Craig, and had the title, but then obviously vacated the title. So he actually is still technically the champion because he didn't lose. So you're going to have someone who's double champ versus the guy who never lost his title. It's going to be a high-level fight, and you can't complain.
Yeah, Pereira is the star, not O'Malley. Again, in O'Malley's card, UFC 299, we're not saying it's not a bad card. It's a great card. I'll be excited for it, but it is a card that looks like the main event slot got pulled out, like almost like Jones Cormier, where the main event got pulled. It was a really stacked card, but the main event went away, so you had to bump up O'Malley versus Vera. Obviously, that's not true, but that's what the card looks like.
It's a great co-main event.
Yeah, well, UFC 300, O'Malley's not the star. You've got people who would sell more pay-per-views than him on UFC 300. Multiple. Oliveira, Gaethje, Holloway, Pereira. These guys are bigger stars than O'Malley is.
And Topuria is too now.
Yeah, you've got all these guys on one card that's over UFC 299. UFC 299 will not get me up that I guess it would because it's a balanced card, but O'Malley versus Vera is not going to get me up on fight day, and it is a card missing a strong main event, while UFC 300 has a strong main event, not a super strong, but the best card we've ever seen.